This awesome Speaking of Books event brought to you by the UMD Libraries out of the University of Maryland, College Park. My name is Drew Barker, and I'm the Performing Arts Librarian here at the Libraries. And I'm very excited today to welcome Dr. Katherine Knight Steele. Before I introduce her, I do want to tell you all that I'm sure you're going to have lots of comments and questions. We do have the chat open for all those awesome comments. But if you have a question in particular for Dr. Steele, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A section of the chat. The Q&A section will allow us to not lose those questions specifically meant for Dr. Steele, but by all means, keep the chat roaring as we talk. And so, yeah, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. So I'm going to introduce Katherine Knight Steele, and we will then kind of have a conversation, and then we will turn it over to you all for a Q&A, of course. But Katherine Knight Steele is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park, and was the founding director of the African American Digital Humanities Initiative. And now she directs the Black Communication and Technology Lab, or BCaT, as a part of the Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network, funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. Her research focuses on race, gender, and media, with a specific emphasis on Black culture and discourse in new media. She examines the representations of marginalized communities in the media and how groups resist oppression and practice joy using online technology to create spaces of community. Katherine's research on the Black blogosphere, digital discourses of resistance and joy, and digital Black feminism have been published in such journals as Social Media and Society, Information Communication and Society, and Feminist Media Studies. She is the author of Digital Black Feminism, published by NYU this past October 2021, which examines the relationship between Black women and technology as a centuries-long gendered and racial project in the US. And so now, without any further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Katherine Knight Steele how this book in particular, Digital Black Feminism, first began as a project for you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Drew, for stepping in and hosting this. I'm so appreciative to be here. It's awesome to be on campus, even virtually, speaking to colleagues and students about the book. So Digital Black Feminism, I think, has, it depends on how you tell the origin story, but I did my dissertation research on the Black blogosphere. I didn't go to graduate school thinking that that's what I would study, but I found myself in a set of circumstances where I was reading about this new thing, this internet culture in graduate school, and increasingly finding that the only way that Black folks were being talked about in relationship to Black culture online, or to culture online, was in our absence. And it didn't square with what I knew to be true from my own lived experience during those years in graduate school and just before. I was working in the advertising industry for a few years while I was getting my master's degree, and found that most of my time that I spent between meetings or calls, I spent online in the blogs. And I spent them in those places because these circumstances that surrounded me were so different than everything I knew before that point. I was one of very few Black women who was working in that very large office. I kind of stole away to my computer to these enclaves, these spaces where our ideas and thoughts were centered, where the jokes made sense, where the hair looked like mine. And I went to school at night, and instead what I was reading there was saying that Black folks weren't online, that we didn't understand this thing called technology. And it's kind of odd to hear now with how often Black Twitter and is talked about in mainstream press, but in the early 2000s, that's not what the literature looked like in the field of communication. And so a lot of my interest in the blogosphere came from that kind of personal space. And so I wrote my dissertation research on the blogosphere. And there was one chapter where I was able to really give attention to the Black women bloggers who were the reason that I began writing about that space. But I couldn't write my whole dissertation on it, or I didn't write my whole dissertation on it. And so I told myself when I had the opportunity to do a book project that wasn't on a timetable or wasn't on the same kind of timetable that a dissertation is under, that I would return to the Black feminist bloggers who I thought were doing things with digital technology that far surpassed what not only people expected of them, but what the tools were designed to do in the first place. And so that is where digital Black feminism was born, was in a small subsection of one chapter of the dissertation that I neglected and wanted to return to, and spent years afterwards coming back and spending more and more time thinking not only about the blogosphere, but the long history of how Black women and technology have been sewn together in the fabric of the US.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting journey when so many graduate students aspire just to publish their whole dissertation as a book.
Yeah.
But instead you went back and wanted to focus on something that was kind of regenerative and generative for you. And I know that in your introduction to your book, which you have on your website, if people want to read that, those first 19 pages of your book, you talk about how the book is kind of a report of the current times.
Yeah.
And if it then is kind of a report of the current times the last few years, do you see yourself then creating a second volume of the report in a few years later on?
Yeah, I mean, so this book kind of pulls from, as I said, the blogosphere of the early 2000s. It talks about apps like Instagram and Twitter, and it comes pretty far into the present. But I think you rightly point out there had to be a stopping point. The editor required it, and so I couldn't and don't discuss things that are happening since the 2020 election, for example. And that's exactly when the manuscript was due. And so much was happening online at that point. So many changes, I think, have occurred in our relationship with technology as it relates to capitalism and influencer culture and celebrity culture in the last few years that I think are not only extend some of the arguments of the text, but I think go in some different directions, or have pushed me in some different directions. So the short answer is there probably won't be a second volume of this text, but it has enlivened some different kinds of questions for me since the text came out, which is, I was surprised that so many folks read this as a text about activism or about social justice, because that was not how I would have described the book. And what that indicated for me was that we need a lens through which to very clearly and directly talk about Black women that is not about resistance, that is about the full expression of things like joy and pleasure. And that is the interest that I have for the next chapter of this text, is not to disregard notions of justice or activism, but to provide other tools and mechanisms for seeing the fullness of Black experience in digital space that aren't centered on things like activism or resistance, but instead center the pleasure of the individual.
That makes sense. That sounds like fantastic fodder for another book. It's interesting that it seems as if like the time, that cultural moment of the last couple years helped shape the reception of the book in a surprising way.
Yeah.
And just real quick to back up, for those of us who might not know about the publication process, you said you submitted your manuscript to the publisher like 2020, but it's not published until almost a year later, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the first full draft of the book was finished mid 2020. So, there's a lot that's happened since then. And so
right.
the only kind of touch that one has on the book during that publication window, which is about, at NYU anyway, it's almost a year, it's about 10 months long, are proofs and edits, which are not major changes, right? So I can make corrections during that time of things that are like no longer factually accurate. But, long additions aren't possible. And so I was submitting my text, I was finishing the writing process in that very volatile summer of 2020, which is the, real heat of the pandemic, which is the uprisings that are happening across the country, right in the full fervor of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery's murders. And it was an interesting time to be finishing the text. And so I think the moment that you kind of see that come out in the book is in the conclusion, because that was the moment where I was working on the conclusion and I was sitting with that heaviness, which felt so different for me than the rest of the book did. The rest of the book, even though I'm talking about enslavement and labor and those other pieces, it's not a book that dwells for long periods of time in what I would say is the pain or the violence of the Black experience, but rather, as I alluded to, kind of the joyness and fullness, right? When I'm speaking of the blogosphere for chapters or talking about Twitter or Cardi B or anything else, I'm talking about the enlivened body of Black women, the intelligent discourse, the hair conversations, the funny memes. And then it was time to write the conclusion. And it was at a moment where there was this looming election, where there was this violence that was happening against Black folks that was on a continuous loop on our screens, where there was a pandemic raging and killing thousands and thousands of folks, which is still raging. And so it was an interesting time to conclude the book. And I think that is the moment where in the conclusion, I had to at least give voice to the fact that I'm writing this during this time. Likely all of these things will still be happening at the moments that we're reading them. And so there's no attempt to pretend that these issues aren't going on, but it is incumbent upon us, I think, particularly upon us who study groups that are historically and traditionally marginalized, to write to our fullness and to think about and give space to the moments of our lives and the discussions of our lives that do not center white supremacy, that do not center patriarchy. And the real goal of the text is actually to decenter those things and to place Black women's experience at the center of how we begin to think about technology, so that we have access to different ways of asking questions that are not focused on those as our primary goals and objectives.
Yes, and in that way, I think the book was able to not only respond to that moment of 2020 and 21, like that helps keep it very much alive in the cultural discourse because of the questions that aren't going to go away anytime soon.
That's right.
And speaking of those questions that don't go away, you start your first proper chapter in the middle of the 19th century, correct? Or antebellum period, at least. Yeah. Can you talk about why you decided to go that far back in time?
I am exceedingly grateful for the unforeseen long publication process of this book, because I think I would have written a very different book if things had gone according to the plan I had when I left graduate school many years ago. But because I came to Maryland and restarted my clock and was fortunate to work with the African American Digital Humanities Initiative, which placed me next to archivists and historians and folks in the English department who were doing long histories of literatures, things that I did not study, frankly, in my graduate program, right? I thought of myself mostly as a presentist until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I would have written a different book that didn't begin in that place. But in order to be true to telling the story of Black women in technology, what I found myself doing was knocking back further in time every time I thought that I was done. So it began as, well, I'm just going to write back. If I'm going to write about the blogosphere, I suppose I do have to write about those years preceding it and what that looked like. But if I'm going to write about that, I suppose I do have to write a bit about, and as I was going, it really became important and necessary to tell the full story of how Black women carved out of this country a space for ourselves, how we created in the midst of these things like enslavement and torture and violence, full experiences of life that included innovation and design and creativity, both for purposes of survival, but also to thrive, to enjoy. And so that's why the book begins in that place. It is to make sure that in the recentering and the retelling of our story of technology, that we are starting really back as far as we can within this cultural context, within this US cultural context. And I'm very clear to say that this is a book that is very US centric. It's very much focused on the experience of Black women in these United States, with the hopes that folks across the diaspora will take up pieces of this and draft their own contexts and their own experiences. But I begin in that place because it's important to retell the story of technology by changing the narrative and changing the framework of what gets to constitute a technology. And I think it's important that we do that because there are very clear decisions that went into dissociating technology from Black folks, from women, from queer folks, from non-binary folks. There's a very intentional practice that happens at the center of a patriarchal white supremacist society that decides that a technology, that technologists and that expertise reside in certain hands. And so to tell that story, I had to really begin before that kind of decoupling occurred.
So it just reminds me of the same kind of white supremacist control of literacy in general. So like communication is powerful and dangerous.
Right.
So but I like how you really wanted to focus on the labor that was involved during like the 19th century and specifically to Black women and what that meant for their own communication and then what that meant for their liberation as well.
Right. Right.
There's such a, I mean, it's such a obvious line that also is marginalized.
That's right. That's right. It's a very strange thing to, at the same time, decide that Black women are low skilled, are not talented, are not contributors, and also at the same time acknowledge how much Black women's labor is central to the building of this imperialist space, right? So how we have been able to manage those simultaneously as a nation in our history is a fascinating enterprise, I think. And it's a required enterprise for what exactly was done, which was determining that the labor and the ingenuity of Black people generally in this country was not there, whilst relying so deeply and so heavily on it. It was a necessary part of building, I think, the structure that we're in now. And so I think in order to talk about that in the present, in order to recognize how we're still doing that for so many groups, we're still saying that this is low skilled work, that this is low paid work because it doesn't require advanced education or it doesn't require lots of training. So we don't have to pay that. I mean, the living wages aren't necessary and these things aren't required. We're doing the same thing, right? And so to tell that story in the present, it was really important for me to kind of go back and talk about that in a period of enslavement. One of the most powerful things I read and that I cite in the text is a historian writing about the transatlantic slave trade who documents the rationale for bringing certain groups of Africans into bondage and says very clearly, if Black folks were not skilled, they would not have been bought and sold and traded as laborers. It is the complete opposite of the story that we tell ourselves, which is that we went to get unskilled folks to do the work that no one wanted to do. No, we went to get folks who knew how to do the work that no one else knew how to do. And when we just do that bit of a switch in our language, when we just make that turn in the way that we tell our history, it really opens up possibilities. What if we actually did imagine that enslaved Africans were the skilled workers, were the experts, were the technologists? What then might that say about the next 200 years of our history? Where would we turn to look for examples of ingenuity? How would we change our record and our record keeping to try to acknowledge what we can find out right now about what people who have the least access to technologies do with those technologies? Folks who have been kept out of spaces are probably in the best position to understand how to use them rather than the folks that they were designed for. And so that's why I do that work, is so that now in 2020 and 2022, I can look at Black women online and I can say, this is a group who social media was not designed for, right? That the blogosphere was not designed for. And yet that then provides the most rich and generous space to find out what's possible there. What can be done in a space when you have to figure out from the ground how to use it, how to manipulate it, how to change it for your own ends. it's actually much more interesting than looking at the folks who the technologies are designed for them to use.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that elaboration. That made me think about a lot of things, books and plays that I've read, and then just histories. Reminded of the pushback that other women, especially because I follow Hannah Nicole Jones on Twitter, and she's always pushing up against other people who, I mean, just her main thesis about the 1619 Project. And Ira Berlin said that you cannot understand American history without slavery.
No, it's
right?
not possible.
Exactly. And for the people who can't wrap their heads around that, or don't want to admit it, don't want to concede that, then of course they're going to also marginalize other modes of communication or storytelling or culture that tries to claim Americanness.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to change our paradigm, right? And in the most generous possible way, when I'm in a generous mood, it's hard for folks because placing enslavement at the foundation of the American experiment, right, really requires us to disabuse ourselves of so many ideas that we're socialized to understand about ourselves, about our society, about our culture from a very young age. And so it's a challenge, to do that. And I understand in a lot of ways folks' resistance to that, because so many of those things that we're trained to believe are about ourselves. We're trained to believe in meritocracy, right? We're trained to believe in bootstrapism, and we're trained to believe that people who work hard enough will get farther, right? And we're very indebted to those ideas. Especially those who are at the bottom end of the financial system in the US are very trained to those ideas. And so letting go of those is letting go of an idea that I am in control completely of my destiny. That's really hard to do. That's a very difficult shift to make. I think it's a worthwhile shift, obviously, but I think it's a difficult one to make.
Well said. You also, the questions that we discussed prior to this talk, you mentioned how also in your introduction that you don't look at a bunch of data, you're not crunching a bunch of data, but instead you see yourself as a person within the community and looking at this. And so you said that you've been questioned about your ethical approach, but also your methodology in your approach. Can you talk more about how that influenced and even became part of the that beauty shop metaphor within the book?
Sure. Yeah. So we were chatting just before this about, the method question and how I teach methods, in my department. And I'm one of the weird people who really actually enjoys talking about method and training on method. So I'll try not to drone on too long. But I think the primary descriptor of what I do can be summarized as being there. I think that in digital studies very frequently, we are learning, and I teach these methods as well. We're teaching about scraping the web, about big data analysis, about how when we have access to now billions of, millions of posts and millions of tweets, how do we, best figure out thematic analysis or do networking or mapping of those tweets? And all of those things, I think, have real valid place with certain questions. The questions that I was interested in for this text required something different. I think that they required my presence, because I not only was looking at things as they were happening, tweets and blog posts, if we're going back, some of these blog posts that I was looking at happened 10 plus years ago now. So I was there for those. I was physically there while they were occurring. I was watching them occur as they happened. I think that mattered in the sense that I needed to see the context of how the world was unfolding while people were doing their writing and their posting, right? And so it's one thing to go back, and I've done this for other projects, to go back and collect things, to collect data that has occurred over time. But it's quite another to be present in community with folks while something is happening, to know the backstory of what they're saying. And I can give you a quick example of this from the text. There is a writer that I write about in the book whose name is Jamila Lemieux. She's a brilliant writer and editor. And I've followed her career for years and years. And I was casually scrolling my Twitter feed, as I do, and came across the post one day. And it happened to be on a day that a mutual of ours posted, wrote his book came out. And everyone kind of was writing about how happy they were for him that his book came out and hashtagging him. And she had a tweet on that day that simply said, I edited some of your favorite writers before they were your favorite writers. It's hard to watch their books come out before mine. And I knew who she was talking about, but I only knew who she was talking about and what she was talking about. And I only knew how happy she was actually for this person because I was there at the time that the posts were happening. If I had come back later and tried to look for a hashtag, I wouldn't have found one. There was, in fact, no hashtag associated with what she wrote. There was no context provided for what she wrote. And so unless I had been following this person's writing for the years leading up to this and the days following that, there would have been no way to know what she meant or who she meant it about or how her feelings about publishing had shifted in that process of watching people have their books come out ahead of hers. And so that's what I mean about that idea of being there in digital spaces. And we gather so much of what that method looks like from ethnography, from the idea of being in community and being present for these ideas. Digital ethnography sometimes, I think, gets a false rap, which is that people think, oh, well, I'm online, so I'm a digital ethnographer. But it's not quite that, right? And anyone who's done actual ethnographic work, of which I don't claim, but it requires a relationship, I think, with the people that you're writing with and for and to, that I take very seriously, because that tweet out of context could have seemed mean. It could have seemed like she didn't care about that person or was upset about that person. But being in relationship with the folks that I'm writing about, even, and I want to be clear, not asking them, not saying I'm writing a book about you and here's what's going on, rather forming a relationship through their words, through the time that's spent there, and through the amount of care that I require of myself in my process, gave me the context necessary to write about that ethically. And I feel more confident about that now because Jamila and I gave a talk together a month ago. And so she's not mad at me for having written about it, which I worried about, at the time. But I think also what being there means is that when I then, in the next chapter, after the blogging chapter, am writing about Anna Julia Cooper and Zora Neale Hurston, that I also have to be there with their words in the same way, that it is my task to be in that archival space with their correspondence and their memoirs and their notes in the way that I'm in the space with people's tweets and Facebook posts, where I begin to get lost so much in their writing that I forget what my questions are, and instead am there to be a patient observer of their process over time. And so I try to then draw lines back and forth between that historical work and this present digital space, because I think these ideas speak to each other. And I think it is incumbent upon anyone who's doing then digital work to learn from what that process looks like of being in an archive, of being in the material space, of what folks have documented, of how those classification processes have worked, and that we take that then back to the digital realm to say, when I see a tweet like that, that is a very personal tweet that she sent. If we were to categorize that in her archive, it would not be under public address, right? It would be perhaps under a correspondence. It would perhaps be under some kind of diary writing, but it's living on this platform that so many people have deemed a public platform and have decided to study as such. So it's a requirement of us, and part of this method that I suggest then is that you have to be able to be there in that space on Twitter enough to say that this tweet on this day was a part of her public writing. And the next tweet, 2 minutes later, she was writing to a small group of folks who knew what she was talking about, right? And I have to treat those tweets that happen on the same platform from the same author differently. I have to analyze them differently. It requires something different of me.
Yeah, wow. I like how you demystified the archive a bit just there, about studying in the archive and comparing it to social media and being able to immerse yourself to know those writers when you're looking at their original words. But you also complicate that a little bit by asking, how should we categorize social media, and how will academics categorize social media, and what's left of that digital archive 50 years from now, 100 years from now? Those are really big questions, especially for archivists and librarians to think about. But you also mentioned just recently care and self-care, and how, can you talk a little bit about how this immersion is something that you still had to get distance from sometimes, and how you kind of set up boundaries, especially around elections or certain confirmation processes?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, I was like, boundaries, do I have any? And then that reminded me, yes, I do. I mean, the biggest boundary of mine in my work is that I decided a lot of years ago that that there were other folks who were interested in and would study things like hate speech and violence online, and that I was not one of those folks. That's the biggest boundary that I kind of erected in my career in graduate school, because I tried that path. And I recognized that there was not a healthy way for me to engage in that. And that furthermore, my questions were not in that area. I was very clear that racism existed. I was very clear that hate speech existed. I was very clear that violence existed. And I found that the questions that were coming up about that were only reinforcement rather than doing anything to change any narratives about it. And so they didn't interest me as much in the space that I was in. But I think what you point to, and what is very true, is that I tell a story in my introduction about learning processes of self-care, in large part from a lot of the folks that I write about, and how digital life can be very all-consuming, right? It can come at you from all angles. The repetition of stories over and over and over again that seem almost unavoidable when you're in a space can be overwhelming for all of us. And I think all of us have probably experienced that, whether it's related to elections or confirmation hearings or pandemic news or anything, of how all-consuming social media can be in our lives. There was an early point in my writing process of the book where I was in conversation. I was in a meeting, in fact, with a senior person in my field who studied Black feminist thought. And it was during the Kavanaugh hearings in the Senate. And I remember saying, kind of like they had begun talking about them at the start of the meeting. And I said, I'm actually tuning out today on that. I decided to protect my headspace on it. It was really triggering for me and for a lot of folks in a lot of ways. And so I said, I've decided to check out on that. And it was something I was quite proud of, in fact, because I had very little ability to tune out of social media, of news broadly. I consume it like it is both my job and my joy. And so when I decided to do that, I was like, good for me. I'm not looking at the alerts on my phone. I've muted this hashtag, like, look what I've done. And her response was very patronizing, to be blunt. It was, sweet summer child, don't you know that we feminists must engage, that you don't get to check out, that this is important news, this kind of thing. And maybe you're too young to understand how important this is. I was a full grown-up at the time. I was a full assistant professor, a little bit, but it was interesting to me. And I tried to take that, rather than just as a disappointment in that individual's response, as more indicative of a shift, in that the Black feminist writers that I followed online, that I was interested in, were likewise taking those kinds of gaps in those spaces because of the inundation of hostility that we were experiencing in that space, that writing about it, that reacting to those things brought such hatred, brought such violence to our feeds, to our direct messages, to our inboxes, and that there was a gap in, I think, the understanding of what it meant to be socially engaged in those spaces and to receive that kind of hate constantly. and to make the decision to remove yourself from that hatred, or to have the agency to do that, to say, this is not something that is healthy for me, that if I wish to continue to be a voice and to speak truth to power and to do the work, that I do have to, and I do have the right to take care of myself. There seemingly to me was nothing more a Black feminist idea than, here I am, a Black woman who is going to prioritize myself, that I am going to be okay, whatever that looks like for me. That is what is most important. And so I wanted to write about it. And that's what I was marking, I think, in this text, was a cultural shift in the world of Black feminist thought that was, in some part at least, moderated by people's relationship to digital culture. In the same way that there was a cultural shift in Black feminist thought, I think, that happened in the late 80s and early 90s and mid 90s, as it was related to hip hop culture, that this cultural phenomenon had had such an impact on the Black experience and on Black women more specifically, that it required Black feminism to shift. It required it to open up. It required some cracks that didn't exist before. It required, as Joan Morgan said, for us to deal with the grays. And I think that digital culture has done the same, and has provoked different questions and different challenges as well.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that elaboration as well. The next question I have for you is one that we discussed prior as well. How does interdisciplinarity play a role in this book, both in method and content? You know, you spoke to method a little bit, but how can fields like history and sociology and communication all be in conversation about digital media?
I think that not only can they be, but we must be. We must be in conversation. The more time that I have to work with students in my field and in other fields who are fashioning themselves as digital scholars, which, by the way, is really exciting to me, is to watch the fact that folks, like, from the beginning of their graduate program get to do this, that they get to declare that this is what they're going to study, is very, I mean, I'm going on a bit, but I think it's wonderful that there's now this crafted field of study in digital studies, right? And Black digital studies even. But that said, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we pretend that our discipline holds all the keys to our understanding. And I think all disciplines are guilty of this in some way. I think, you know, mine is not excluded, that we sometimes, if our discipline has not been the one to write about this in depth before, and we are ignoring what other folks have done and what they have thought through, and the long, painstaking work that has gone into the literature existing in these other spaces. And so for this text, for example, it would have been easy to, and it you know, is possible to begin telling this story in 2015, right? To start talking about social media, and to start talking about hashtags, and to begin talking about this at the outset of Trayvon Martin or something like that. But in what world is that the beginning of Black activism? Or is that the beginning of our relationship with technology? It just isn't. And so we have to stretch ourselves to see the world through different questioning eyes, to understand how other folks have been disciplined to ask questions differently, and therefore come to different ideas, possibly before we do. And that's good. That is exciting, because what it allows for us to do is not reinvent the wheel, and not to ask questions that other folks have been answering for 20 years. When I was writing my dissertation, I thought initially that I was writing about the Black barbershop as it was manifested in the blogosphere. And I was going to be writing about newspapers and television media and news, and a little bit of digital is what I thought I was going to do. But it was going to be about the barbershop, right? And it was going to be about BET, and I was going to talk about religiosity and Bible, you know, and all these things, right? Orality into the Bible and all these things. And then I picked up inadvertently this copy of Melissa Harris Perry's book, Barbershops, Bibles, and BETs, that came out the year that I was starting my dissertation research. And I went to my advisor and I said, what am I going to do? She wrote my dissertation. You know, like, this exists already. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And he said, this is great, because now you don't have to do that. what do you really want to ask? Like, she did all of this historical work. She wrote about all of this stuff, about the media and about BET and about the Bible and barbershops. And she went to Chicago and she sat in the barbershop. And you now don't have to do any of that. And she's in this whole different field, right? And so it could have been easy for me to say, well, my field didn't do that. You know, communication didn't do that. And so I still have to do it according to our standards. But what he gave me in that moment was permission to just say, she's already done the work in that discipline. I can take the best of that and I can expand it. I can build instead of stomp on what's already been done or pretend what already has been done isn't good enough because it didn't happen in my discipline, right? Instead, I can build on that. I can see that as a stepping stone to a question that I want to ask in a particular way that hasn't been asked before. And so that's what I always encourage of my students now, is to go see what other folks are doing in other places and see your work as building rather than as challenging, as pushing back at. Like, this language we use so often in the academy is like, they didn't do it right, they didn't get it. And so we teach students to write in this way so often. And it's such a destructive pattern that I hope we break, which is instead to see the beauty of what someone else has done as, I don't have to do that. I'm so appreciative to you for having laid that groundwork so that I can ask this question, which is related, which builds, which is in conversation. And so I think that that's how I see this book, as hopefully bringing together some conversations that were happening in various fields and placing it in a way that we can all be a part of that conversation together. I'm very grateful to the work we did at AdHume, which was literally putting those people in a room together, right? We sat together and had those conversations for years. And I know that that in so many ways opened up doors for this book to exist.
You endorsing the idea of building definitely corresponds to what you set out in your book, in your introduction. And it's a really just so refreshing to hear that kind of language and that kind of approach to academia. I think we need more of that. It also reminds me of Tressie McMillan Cottom. So she comes from sociology, but her approach seems very similar. And seems to overlap in fun, good ways. But I love this idea of progress and building instead
always forward, right? Our task as creators of knowledge is not to assume that everything that's been thought of before is wrong before we got there, right? And just that, you know, that mentality, I think, happens in so many graduate classrooms and is encouraged in so many reviews of papers. And I think we're all better for having moved in a direction of being appreciative of the work before we find challenge.
Yeah. Before I ask one of the last questions, I want to remind people to put questions for Dr. Steele in the Q&A so that I can easily find them. And you can, of course, keep that chat in the conversation going in the chat. You, in the section in your introduction about our hashtag Black Girls Magic, you kind of posed the question or provoked the question. You say, now perhaps more than ever, it's imperative that we attune our gaze to digital Black feminism. Why? Why now? You do go on to, of course, explicate that, but can I hear you elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was writing the book, there were increasing stories about Black women and technology, but it was kind of the same frustration that I was having at the start of my graduate program, which was most of the conversation that we were having was about deficiency, deviance, and pain, right? And so my provocation is such that if we are going to talk about Black women as recipients of hatred or pain or violence online, we must also talk about Black women as purveyors of skill and expertise in that space, for the clear, evident ways that Black women have navigated digital culture that has not been favorable in order to do things that are of benefit to an entire society. And so, I'm grateful for works like Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology and Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, which have, opened up a lot of folks' eyes to the centrality and the importance of Black women to how we think about a future of tech. And so I think that if we're going to do that, if we're going to start having those conversations, then we need to have full conversations that are not simply about the hate and the violence and the deviance and the dismissal of Black women as true technologists, but also the recentering of Black women's voices in that long history, such that we begin to see Black women in their full expertise. And so that section that you pointed out about Black girl magic was one that I wrote a number of years ago. I was at a conference, and it was a conference section that was a panel rather, that was called Black Girl Magic. And I went to it and I was kind of excited about this panel. It was one panel that I really wanted to see. And I remember feeling sick at the end of this panel because the papers that were being discussed, the speakers were talking about Black women's innate ability to deal with violence. They were suggesting that Black women have a biological predisposition to endure pain at higher levels than other folks. They were doing this not at some white supremacist conference, not at some conference about eugenics, but at a conference that thought that it was celebrating, at a panel that thought that it was celebrating this as something to value about ourselves as Black women, was that, like, look how much we can endure because of our magic. And it occurred to me in that moment that phrase, that Black girl magic phrase, which was intended by Kashawn Thompson and very brilliantly by Kashawn Thompson to highlight the joy and the full, lived experience of Black women, was being taken up in ways that were doing further harm, that was telling folks that there's just some magic within Black women. That's why they get everything done. That's why they're able to make their way out of no way. That's why these things occur. And I thought to myself, we have to undo this. We have to make it clear that there, first of all, is actual pain felt by actual human beings. But secondly, that whatever expertise you see is just that. It is expertise. It is not a sprinkle of magic. It is years of endured skill building, often at our own expense, but it is skill. It is expertise. It is knowledge, and it needs to be recognized as such and centered as such, because the magic feature was not doing that. It was undoing, in many ways, the need for us to be not just at the table, but building the tables around what the future of conversation of technology was going to be. And so I think that, folks, as I said, like Safiya Noble, like Ruha Benjamin, are doing that, right? They are rebuilding tables. Saf's book, Dr. Noble's book on algorithmic bias, changed the game in terms of how we talked about algorithms in this country. That is a rebuilding of a table that places that Black woman's expertise at the center. And that's what I hope that folks take from the text, is a recentering, a reframing, a different way of asking questions, and a different way of provoking new responses to this increasingly digital world that we live in.
That was an excellent point. And I love the idea of not just being at the table, but rebuilding the tables. That sounds like the kind of progress that you were alluding to earlier as well. We do have a question in the Q&A section. Benjamin asks, for the benefit of young ladies, comment on the myth of girl can't do technology.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was a real guiding question for the first chapter of the book. So, I named my introduction for the Black girls who don't code. And the reason I named it that is that there are a lot of fantastic initiatives, and this is in no way disparaging of those, that are attempting to provide resources and possibilities and opportunities for girls, and for Black girls specifically, to gain specific skill sets and things like coding. And that's all well and good. But I think that if our focus is there, that if our focus is we need more resources for girls to learn how to code or to become interested in STEM learning, that what we're doing is really erasing an entire history of girls as technologists, right? Of girls who already possess technological skill. And instead what's happened is we have changed our definition of technology to exclude their skill sets, right? So if we go back to early parts of the Americas and what women were doing, what Black women were doing, both in the field and in the household, as artisans, as domestics, they were in fact innovating and using technology in discreetly amazing ways, right? And then what happened was we decided that that wasn't a technology. We decided that that was domesticity, or that that was low skilled labor, right?
Mhm.
We took the titling away, but the skill sets never dissipated. And so just because we have determined that technology for us now is going to mean things with screens or with O's and ones, that does not mean that women broadly and Black women specifically do not possess skill sets required to be successful in technology. What it means is that we have to reimagine what technology is and what it looks like. And it's why in the book, I don't necessarily trace the lineage of engineers or computer scientists as women. I think that that's a fantastic thing for folks to do. And there are some folks at Maryland who are doing that very well, in fact, who are thinking about Black women in computing, right? Working at NASA or serving in those capacities, very important things. What I'm looking at are things like hair braiding, right? And how it is that we have started, we do not consider this particular technology of hair as a technology, or how then we transfer that to a space like digital culture and we don't consider someone building out their brand on Instagram as having technological expertise. They're just those influencer girls. They're just those girls who have their shops. Well, you know what? There are multi-billion-dollar corporations who are utilizing the models that those girls with their shops have set up as their new strategies and are using those to build their wealth, right? So there's some talent there. There's some expertise there. There's some mastery of technology there, right? There are folks who are setting up their own blogging platforms and folks who are pushing toward content moderation policies that are outside of what Twitter ever imagined necessary, right? There's some technologists in there. And so I think to answer your question about, how do we change this myth? It's partly by telling our true story, by being honest about how things have developed over time. But it's also pushing back against these practices that really suggest that we're operating in deficiency. It bothers me to no end when that is our starting point, because I think if we begin by telling folks that they are at a deficient, and it's not me, right? Our education scholars on campus will confirm, when we tell folks that they're deficient at things, they are deficient at those things, right? This is what education research teaches us, is that if two sets of students go in to take a test and we tell the girls, don't worry about it, girls aren't good at science, they won't be. Because they have that as the leading mythology around their lives. I remember the moment that I stopped caring about science, and it's specifically being attached to someone saying, well, you're better at reading and writing, and that's probably what you're going to do. So you should focus on that. And that seemed plausible to me, right? Like, okay, you know this better than I do. And so we do this both on an individual level, but as a society, we're doing that. When we center these coding programs and these women in STEM programs, which again have their place, but when we use those as the panacea, right? As this is what will save us, this is what will fix us, then what we're saying is the problem is with you girls, right? The problem is that you haven't figured out this technology yet. And that's not the issue. That's really not the problem.
Yeah, I would agree. I wish more people would. The idea that you just spoke of kind of recognizing and discovering innovation, it reminds me of history from below and making sure that we are not just looking at the big movers and shakers, but we're looking at the everyday people who are doing the work.
That's right.
And how are they doing? How are they innovating, doing the work? And
it's really hard for us to do, though, right? Because I think part of a feature of American storytelling is like the great man, right? And so we tend to center our whole history on the great man idea. So when we talk about computers and computing, it's like, well, remember Steve Jobs in his garage and Bill Gates in his, right? Like that way of telling stories that has carried, it's not just a US tradition, but it's a very Western one, right? This idea that we center a whole history around one person. We do this with civil rights, right? We're like, Martin Luther King ran the civil rights movement, despite all of what history tells us to be true about on the ground organizing and activist movements that have happened for decades before and after, right? But the great myth of the great man is such a powerful construct. And the problem there is, one, that it's just not true, right? But also that it continues to do that work of, as you said, kind of pushing the everydayness and the brilliance and the creativity and the endurance of a people to the side. And that is really detrimental for what we decide to do going forward if we're always waiting for the next great man to make changes.
Right. Well, it would be remiss for me to not try to end with asking you who you are currently following on social media right now that is inspiring or is instigating, or just kind of lighting you up right now.
Oh, that's a good one. I'll do a podcast because I am super late to the podcast train. And my favorite new podcast is called Stuck with Damon Young. I write about Damon in the book. He was a blogger for the blog Very Smart Brothers for years and years. Now writes for the Washington Post and New York Times and has like a bestseller. But his new podcast, Stuck, I love it. It's like my first one where I subscribe so that it comes up on my phone. I know I should be more on top of these things because I'm a digital scholar, but I didn't get into podcasting early. As far as social media, I think the thing that is enlivening for me on social media now is the move back to Enclave. So my actual factual friends are the ones who bring me joy in those spaces more than my public follows these days, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah. And what do you mean by enclave? Can you unpack that?
So I talk in the book. Katherine Squires gives us this beautiful language of thinking instead of counterpublic, which is a term that I think a lot of us have heard before. Nancy Fraser has talked about subaltern counterpublics, these spaces of dialogue and debate that spring up that are not the public spaces, but they're the ones that talk back to the public spaces. Katherine Squires suggests that instead of every space that marginalized people gather being a counterpublic space, that sometimes we form these enclaves or these satellite spaces, which are actually intentionally not seen by the dominant group. The enclaves are work in private spaces. They exist for the purposes of that group. They are not trying to be seen by or accepted by the dominant group. And so the discourse that happens in those spaces is very different. They're much harder to study as researchers because you're not supposed to be there unless you're supposed to be there. And so I am very deeply grateful for the welcome to some of those spaces and the ability to find respite from the very public spaces that are a requirement of our current digital life.
Well, it sounds like, your privileged access and how you honor that, the way you take care of yourself and others, and the ambition and scope that you have for your project is all benefiting the success of your book and the success of your ideas, or the attractiveness of those ideas. And I hope it catches on even more. Congratulations on the book, by the way.
Thanks so much.
And I am, yes, indeed, trying to wind down. So if you have one last question, you better get it in now. You're getting a lot of love in the chat, just so you know. Make sure you check that out before we leave. But I think I love how your approach is an interdisciplinary approach. I love how you take a kind of a long look at history and connect it to what we're doing today. As a theater practitioner, the best plays are the plays that speak to history and today. And I think you do mention that, how culture is one of those sites that can create resistance and progress, and we can't discount that. And it reminds me of when the pandemic started in 2020, everyone went straight to culture. They went straight to social media, Netflix, HBO, etc. And all of that was still somehow marginalized and thought lesser than, and thought of not as real work.
Not real, right, that's right. Yeah.
And it's bizarre to me, but we do have one more question. Any thoughts on Octavia Butler? Large question.
Lots of thoughts. Read her work. I mean, I'm really excited about the upcoming. I think they're turning some Octavia Butler into possibly some movies, and I'm like, oh my gosh, which ones? I'm excited. So I mean, that's my thought. I don't know if I have more to offer, but read it. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I second that. Reading Octavia Butler and looking for how that's going to be produced. I forget.
I will be very interested to see what that production looks like. Yeah.
But I think that we've caught up with her vision. Like,
that's it.
Like we're able to let it come out now. So that's wonderful. Thank you again so much, Dr.
Thank
Steele.
you. Let me remind folks, the introduction is on my website, which is just katherineKnightSteele.com. It's at the library as well, so you can check it out. And if you plan on buying a copy, New York University Press is kind enough to extend a 30% off discount with the code Steele30 at checkout.
I've just put her website in the chat where you can find that book. And I think her code is on her website as well. So you don't have to remember that. Just go to her website, get the book.
Thank you all for coming. I've read your comments. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for your presence.